Hello and welcome, Fright friends, to this, the Horror Story Corner, where tonight we have not one, but two tales of the macabre, to both electrify and petrify your nerves. Our first tale aligns with the old adage, don't talk to strangers, for they're only there to do you harm. This is certainly true for a poor, wandering clergyman, setting out to provide support for his parishioners, but ending up here instead, in the Horror Story Corner. I hope you enjoy William Friar Harvey's Across the Moor. It really was most unfortunate. Peggy had a temperature of nearly 100, and a pain in her side, and Mrs. Workington Bancroft knew that it was appendicitis. But there was no one whom she could send for the doctor. James had gone with the jaunting car to meet her husband, who had at last managed to get away for a week's shooting. Adolphe she had sent to the Evershams only half an hour before, with a note for Lady Eva. The cook could not manage to walk, even if dinner could be served without her. Kate, as usual, was not to be trusted. There remained Miss Craig. "Of course, you must see that Peggy is really ill," said she, as the governess came into the room, in answer to her summons. "The difficulty is that there is absolutely no one whom I can send for the doctor." Mrs. Workington Bancroft paused. She was always willing that those beneath her should have the privilege of offering the services which it was her right to command. "So, perhaps, Miss Craig," she went on, "you would not mind walking over to Tibbet's farm. I hear there is a Liverpool doctor staying there. Of course, I know nothing about him, but we must take the risk, and I expect he'll be only too glad to be earning something during his holiday. It's nearly 4 miles, I know, and I'd never dream of asking you if it was not that I dread appendicitis so." "Very well," said Miss Craig. "I suppose I must go, but I don't know the way." "Oh, you can't miss it," said Mrs. Workington Bancroft, in her anxiety temporarily forgiving the obvious unwillingness of her governess's consent. "You will follow the road across the moor for 2 miles, until you come to Redmond's Cross. You turn to the left there, and follow a rough path that leads through a large plantation, and Tebbet's farm lies just below you in the valley. And take Pontiff with you," she added, as the girl left the room. "There's absolutely nothing to be afraid of, but I expect you'll feel happier with the dog." "Well, miss," said the cook, when Miss Craig went into the kitchen to get her boots, which had been drying by the fire. "Of course she knows best, but I don't think it's right after all that's happened for the mistress to send you across the moors on a night like this. It's not as if the doctor could do anything for Miss Margaret, if you do bring him. Every child is like that once in a while. He'll only say put her to bed, and she's already there." "I don't see what there is to be afraid of, cook," said Miss Craig, as she laced her boots, "unless you believe in ghosts." "I'm not so sure about that. Anyhow, I don't like sleeping in a bed where the sheets are too short for you to pull them over your head. But don't you be frightened, miss. It's my belief that their bark is worse than their bite." But though Miss Craig amused herself for some minutes by trying to imagine the bark of a ghost, a thing altogether different from the classical ghostly bark, she did not feel entirely at ease. She was naturally nervous, and living as she did in the hinterland of the servants' hall, she had heard vague details of true stories that were only myths in the drawing-room. The very name of Redmond's Cross sent a shiver through her. It must have been the place where that horrid murder was committed. She had forgotten the tale, though she remembered the name. Her first disaster came soon enough. Pontiff, who was naturally slow-witted, took more than 5 minutes to find out that it was only the governess he was escorting. But once the discovery had been made, he promptly turned tail, paying not the slightest heed to Miss Craig's feeble whistle. And then, to add to her discomfort, the rain came, not in heavy drops, but driving in sheets of thin spray that blotted out what few landmarks there were upon the moor. They were very kind at Tebbott's farm. The doctor had gone back to Liverpool the day before, but Mrs. Tebbott gave her hot milk and turf cakes, and offered her reluctant son to show Miss Craig a shorter path onto the moor that avoided the larch wood. He was a monosyllabic youth, but his presence was cheering, and she felt the night doubly black when he left her at the last gate. She trudged on wearily. Her thoughts had already gone back to the almost exhausted theme of the bark of ghosts, when she heard steps on the road behind her that were at least material. Next minute, the figure of a man appeared. Miss Craig was relieved to see that the stranger was a clergyman. He raised his hat. "I believe we are both going in the same direction," he said. "Perhaps I may have the pleasure of escorting you." She thanked him. "It is rather weird at night," she went on. "And what with all the tales of ghosts and bogies that one hears from the country people, I've ended by being half afraid myself." "I can understand your nervousness," he said, "especially on a night like this. I used at one time to feel the same, for my work often meant lonely walks across the moor, to farms which were only reached by rough tracks, difficult enough to find even in the daytime." "And you never saw anything to frighten you? Nothing immaterial, I mean?" "I can't really say that I did. But I had an experience 11 years ago which served as the turning point in my life, and since you seem to be now in much the same state of mind as I was in then, I will tell it you. The time of year was late September. I had been over to Westendale to see an old woman who was dying, and then, just as I was about to start on my way home, word came to me of another of my parishioners who had been suddenly taken ill only that morning. It was after 7, when at last I started. A farmer saw me on my way, turning back when I reached the Moor Road. The sunset the previous evening had been one of the most lovely I ever remember seeing. The whole vault of heaven had been scattered with flakes of white cloud, tipped with rosy pink like the strewn petals of a full-blown rose. But that night all was changed. The sky was an absolutely dull slate colour, except in one corner of the west where a thin rift showed the last saffron tint of the sullen sunset. As I walked, stiff and footsore, my spirits sank. It must have been the marked contrast between the two evenings, the one so lovely, so full of promise. The corn was still out in the fields, spoiling for fine weather. The other so gloomy, so sad with all the dead weight of autumn and winter days to come. And then added to this sense of heavy depression came another different feeling, which I surprised myself by recognizing as fear. I did not know why I was afraid. The moors lay on either side of me, unbroken except for a strangling line of turf, shooting butts, that stood within a stone's throw of the road. The only sound I had heard for the last half an hour was the cry of the startled grouse. Go back, go back, go back. But yet the feeling of fear was there, affecting a low centre of my brain through some little used physical channel. I buttoned my coat closer and tried to divert my thoughts by thinking of next Sunday's sermon. I had chosen to preach on Job. There is much in the old-fashioned notion of the book, apart from all the subtleties of the higher criticism, that appeals to country people. the loss of herds and crops, the break-up of the family. I would not have dared to speak had not I too been a farmer. My own glebe land had been flooded 3 weeks before, and I suppose I stood to lose as much as any man in the parish. As I walked along the road repeating to myself the first chapter of the book, I stopped at the 12th verse. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. The thought of the bad harvest, and that is an awful thought in these valleys, vanished. I seemed to gaze into an ocean of infinite darkness. I had often used, with the Sunday glibness of the tired priest, whose duty it is to preach 3 sermons in one day, the old simile of the chessboard. God and the devil were the players, and we were helping one side or the other. But until that night I had not thought of the possibility of my being only a pawn in the game, that God might throw away that the game might be won. I had reached the place where we are now. I remember it by that rough stone water trough, when a man suddenly jumped up from the roadside. He had been seated on a heap of broken road metal. "Which way are you going, governor?" he said. I knew from the way he spoke that the man was a stranger. There are many at this time of year who come up from the south, tramping northwards with the ripening corn. I told him my destination. "We'll go along together," he replied. It was too dark to see much of the man's face, but what little I made out was coarse and brutal. Then he began the half-menacing whine I knew so well. He had tramped miles that day. He had had no food since breakfast, and that was only a crust. "Give us a copper," he said. "It's only for a night's lodging." He was whittling away with a big clasp knife at an ash stake he had taken from some hedge. The clergyman broke off. "Are those the lights of your house?" he said. "We are nearer than I expected, but I shall have time to finish my story. I think I will. For you can run home in a couple of minutes, and I don't want you to be frightened when you are out on the moors again." As the man talked, he seemed to have stepped out of the very background of my thoughts. His sordid tale, with the sad lies that hid a far sadder truth. He asked me the time. It was 5 minutes to 9. As I replaced my watch, I glanced at his face. His teeth were clenched, and there was something in the gleam of his eyes that told me at once his purpose. Have you ever known how long a second is? For a third of a second I stood there facing him, filled with an overwhelming pity for myself and him. And then, without a word of warning, he was upon me. I felt nothing. A flash of lightning ran down my spine. I heard the dull crash of the ash stake, and then a very gentle patter like the sound of a far distant stream. For a minute I lay in perfect happiness, watching the lights of the house as they increased in number until the whole heaven shone with twinkling lamps. I could not have had a more painless death. Miss Craig looked up. The man was gone. She was alone on the moor. She ran to the house, her teeth chattering, ran to the solid shadow that crossed and recrossed the kitchen blind. As she entered the hall, the clock on the stairs struck the hour. It was 9 o'clock. Looks like the tales in the servants' quarters were a little more than just rumour, and poor Miss Craig found this out first hand. Still, at least she can rest assured that both the bark and the bite of the spectre she met was not forthcoming. and although her nerves may be rocked, I believe this tale shows us that most often there is more to be feared from the living than there is from the dead. Now, fear fanatics, it's time for our second story, one about a chance encounter between an artist and a gravestone maker. The former having created an image of the latter facing trial for a despicable crime, and the latter having inscribed a grave with the name of the former. Could these two seemingly connected acts bear any relevance on their futures? Or is it nothing more than bizarre coincidence? One thing is for sure. It is an unusually hot day. Hot enough to drive a man to many unspeakable things. I hope you enjoy William Friar Harvey's August Heat. Fenistone Road, Clapham, August 20th. I have had what I believe to be the most remarkable day in my life, and while the events are still fresh in my mind, I wish to put them down on paper as clearly as possible. Let me say at the outset that my name is James Clarence Whittencross. I am 40 years old, in perfect health, never having known a day's illness. By profession I am an artist, not a very successful one, but I earn enough money by my black and white work to satisfy my necessary wants. My only near relative, a sister, died 5 years ago, so that I am independent. I breakfasted this morning at 9, and after glancing through the morning paper, I lighted my pipe and proceeded to let my mind wander in the hope that I might chance upon some subject for my pencil. The room, though the door and windows were open, was oppressively hot, and I had just made up my mind that the coolest and most comfortable place in the neighbourhood would be the deep end of the public swimming bath, when the idea came. I began to draw. So intent was I on my work that I left my lunch untouched, only stopping work when the clock of St. Jude's struck 4. The final result, for a hurried sketch, was, I felt sure, the best thing I had done. It showed a criminal in the dock immediately after the judge had pronounced sentence. The man was fat, enormously fat. The flesh hung in rolls about his chin. It creased his huge, stumpy neck. He was clean-shaven. Perhaps I should say a few days before he must have had been clean-shaven. And almost bald. He stood in the dock, his short, clumsy fingers clasping the rail, looking straight in front of him. The feeling that his expression conveyed was not so much one of horror as of utter absolute collapse. There seemed nothing in the man strong enough to sustain that mountain of flesh. I rolled up the sketch, and without quite knowing why, placed it in my pocket. Then, with the rare sense of happiness which the knowledge of a good thing well done gives, I left the house. I believe that I set out with the idea of calling upon Trenton, for I remember walking along Lytton Street and turning to the right along Gilchrist Road at the bottom of the hill where the men were at work on the new tram lines. From there onwards I have only the vaguest recollection of where I went. The one thing of which I was fully conscious was the awful heat that came up from the dusty asphalt pavement as an almost palpable wave. I longed for the thunder promised by the great banks of copper-coloured cloud that hung low over the western sky. I must have walked 5 or 6 miles when a small boy roused me from my reverie by asking the time. It was 20 minutes to 7. When he left me, I began to take stock of my bearings. I found myself standing before a gate that led into a yard bordered by a strip of thirsty earth, where there were flowers, purple stock and scarlet geranium. Above the entrance was a board with the inscription, C.H.S. Atkinson, monumental mason, worker in English and Italian marbles. From the yard itself came a cheery whistle, the noise of hammer blows, and the cold sound of steel meeting stone. A sudden impulse made me enter. A man was sitting with his back towards me, busy at work on a slab of curiously veined marble. He turned round as he heard my steps, and I stopped short. It was the man I had been drawing, whose portrait lay in my pocket. He sat there, huge and elephantine, the sweat pouring from his scalp, which he wiped with a red silk handkerchief. But though the face was the same, the expression was absolutely different. He greeted me smiling, as if we were old friends, and shook my hand. I apologized for my intrusion. "Everything is hot and glary outside," I said. "This seems an oasis in the wilderness." "I don't know about oasis," he replied. "But it certainly is hot as hell. Take a seat, sir." He pointed to the end of the gravestone on which he was at work, and I sat down. "That's a beautiful piece of stone you've got hold of," I said. He shook his head. "In a way it is," he answered. "The surface here is as fine as anything you could wish, but there's a big flaw at the back, though I don't expect you'd ever notice it. I could never make really a good job of a bit of marble like that. It would be all right in the summer like this. It wouldn't mind that blasted heat. But wait till the winter comes. There's nothing quite like frost to find out the weak points in a stone." "Then what's it for?" I asked. The man burst out laughing. "You'd hardly believe me if I was to tell you it's for an exhibition. But it's the truth. Artists have exhibitions. So do grocers and butchers. We have them too. All the latest little things in headstones, you know." He went on to talk of marbles, which sort best withstood wind and rain, and which were easiest to work. Then of his garden, and a new sort of carnation he had bought. At the end of every other minute he would drop his tools, wipe his shining head, and curse the heat. I said little, for I felt uneasy. There was something unnatural, uncanny in meeting this man. I tried at first to persuade myself that I had seen him before, that his face, unknown to me, had found a place in some out-of-the-way corner of my memory, but I knew that I was practising little more than a plausible piece of self-deception. Mr. Atkinson finished his work, spat on the ground, and got up with a sigh of relief. "There, what do you think of that?" he said, with an air of evident pride. The inscription which I read for the first time was this: "Sacred to the memory of James Clarence Withencroft, born January 18th, 1860. He passed away very suddenly on August 20th, 1900. In the midst of life, we are in death." For some time I sat in silence. Then a cold shudder ran down my spine. I asked him where he had seen the name. "Oh, I didn't see it anywhere," replied Mr. Atkinson. "I wanted some name, and I put down the first that came into my head." "Why do you want to know?" "It's a strange coincidence, but it happens to be mine." He gave a long, low whistle. "And the dates?" "I can only answer for one of them, and that's correct." "It's a rum go," he said. But he knew less than I did. I told him of my morning's work. I took the sketch from my pocket and showed it to him. As he looked, the expression of his face altered until it became more and more like that of the man I had drawn. "And it was only the day before yesterday," he said, "that I told Maria there was no such thing as ghosts." Neither of us had seen a ghost, but I knew what he meant. "You probably heard my name," I said. "And you must have seen me somewhere and forgotten it. Were you at Clacton-on-Sea last July?" I had never been to Clacton in my life. We were silent for some time. We were both looking at the same thing. The 2 dates on the gravestone, and one was right. "Come inside and have some supper," said Mr. Atkinson. His wife was a cheerful little woman, with the flaky red cheeks of the country bred. Her husband introduced me as a friend of his who was an artist. The result was unfortunate, for after the sardines and watercress had been removed, she brought out a Dory Bible, and I had to sit and express my admiration for nearly half an hour. I went outside and found Atkinson sitting on the gravestone smoking. We resumed the conversation at the point we had left off. "You must excuse my asking," I said, "but do you know of anything you've done for which you could be put to trial?" He shook his head. "I'm not bankrupt. The business is prosperous enough. 3 years ago I gave turkeys to some of the guardians at Christmas, but that's all I can think of. And they were small ones, too," he added as an afterthought. He got up, fetched a can from the porch, and began to water the flowers. "Twice a day, regular in the hot weather," he said. "And then the heat sometimes gets the better of the delicate ones. And ferns, good Lord! They could never stand it. Where do you live?" I told him my address. It would take an hour's quick walk to get back home. "It's like this," he said. "We'll look at the matter straight. If you go back home tonight, you take your chance of accidents. A cart may run over you, and there's always banana skins and orange peel, to say nothing of fallen ladders." He spoke of the improbable with an intense seriousness that would have been laughable 6 hours before, but I did not laugh. "The best thing we can do," he continued, "is for you to stay here till 12 o'clock. We'll go upstairs and smoke. It may be cooler inside." To my surprise, I agreed. We are sitting now in a long, low room beneath the eaves. Atkinson has sent his wife to bed. He himself is busy sharpening some tools at a little oilstone, smoking one of my cigars the while. The air seems charged with thunder. I am writing this at a shaky table before the open window. The leg is cracked, and Atkinson, who seems a handyman with his tools, is going to mend it as soon as he is finished putting an edge on his chisel. It is after 11 now. I shall be gone in less than an hour, but the heat is stifling. It is enough to send a man mad. A deliciously open ending. Well, what do we think? Perhaps, horror fans, that nothing happened following the end of this tale. And perhaps James Clarence Withencroft went about his life to its natural end. However, the heat was stifling, and Atkinson did have to hand something sharp. Perhaps then the heat did get too much and led him to do something unspeakable. Who can say? For the answer is buried deep down in the horror story corner. I hope you enjoyed our 2 terrifying tales, and until next time, as ever, sleep well.